cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. By the way, this episode is also available as a video on our YouTube channel. Just search Energypreneurs. Thank you for joining.
Hi, Bridget. Good morning from Manila.
Good morning. Morning, Sahel. Good morning from sunny Australia.
It's good to finally put a face to a name. We've been talking on LinkedIn for quite some time.
Yes, we have. The first time we were talking was about coal power in Cambodia. And I think it was the time when Cambodia had some significant hydropower shortages. And so the government signed up some very large coal power deal. But we work right across Southeast Asia. We don't have to only talk about Cambodia today.
Maybe you can introduce yourself first.
Thank you. My name is Bridget McIntosh. I've been working in Australia and Southeast Asia to support the energy transition for 25 years. Half that time I've spent living in Southeast Asia, and the other half I've spent living and working in the energy transition in Australia. It's been a fantastic opportunity to marry the two together because Australia is in the top 10 for integrating variable renewable energy into the grid in the world. And if Southeast Asia is going to meet their net zero emissions targets, they're going to need to know how to integrate variable renewables into their power systems, particularly because they're so cheap.
Yes, and also seeing is believing. So Australia is not far away to come and have a look. I think it's very important because unless that penny drops, nothing happens.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And particularly because Australia was and still remains to be a very coal-dependent power supply. Most of Southeast Asia depends on coal power. And Australia has transformed and is transforming from a very coal-dependent system to one with high variable renewables like solar and wind. And the main driver in Australia has just been the cost price. Back when I first started working in the energy transition in the late 90s, the Australian government had a renewable energy target, the 2% renewable energy target.
Yes, that famous 2%.
And at the time, I think they had about 6% renewables. The rest really was coal power. And it was very cheap, 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour to produce electricity from coal. And solar and wind was obviously very expensive. But with the mandatory renewable energy target, and with the cost reductions, particularly helped along by China and Germany and the US policies in Germany and the US, and then China meeting that demand and absolutely smashing the cost for solar. We've seen that now solar and wind technologies have a lower cents per kilowatt hour LCOE than coal power. And those technologies beat coal, and when it's a competitive process like it is in Australia with a wholesale electricity market, solar and wind technologies are winning. That's why we will start to see a transformation from a system that was 90% coal to a system where it's going to be 82% renewable energy by 2035, I think, in Australia. Quite a significant shift. Great lessons for Southeast Asia.
It's also a lot of people don't believe that, because I remember I used to work for the Office of the Regulator General Victoria at that time when the 2% came in, and people are saying, how?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because all the renewables was hydropower. And so how are we going to get other technologies? I think it's very interesting because at the time, no one really knew how much variable renewables you could have on the grid. There was this sense that, you can have 5%. And then when a system beat 5%, then that would say, okay, now it's 10%. And then it's 20% and 25%, all the way up to South Australia, where you've got many days where it's 100% run on
even
solar.
More.
And I think they're up to about 65, 70% solar and wind on average over the year. What we once thought wasn't possible certainly is very possible now.
The fossil fuel industry managed to seed that thought that intermittency is a problem. Grid will fall apart. They did it so successfully. Even today, you talk to the policymaker, first thing they said, oh, there's not going to be sun every day. What
Yeah.
happens if there is no sun? I said, okay, if there is no sun, we have to look for a different planet. I think it will be less of a problem. So I think the fossil fuel industry did that quite. And even in Australia, remember the push for CCS?
Yes.
Now I don't
Yes.
see that anymore. So
Yes.
how do you see the landscape has changed? You talk to a lot of senior leaders and others as the prices have come down.
Yeah. So I think the critical part of the landscape that's changed is just the fundamental economics of it. It was easier to push the fact that solar is intermittent and therefore unreliable when it was also expensive. But when it starts to be significantly cheaper, from a system point of view, it makes a whole lot more sense to include it within the system. And so when you're talking to policymakers about economics and saving and lowering costs, that's a far more interesting discussion than if you're having a discussion about environmental climate change. And I find in all the political economy work that we do in Southeast Asia, we very rarely mention climate. It's all about the economic decisions. So it's about security of supply, lowering costs, and the risk of volatile fossil fuel costs and dependency. And so in Australia, as the costs lowered, even when you had a market where the political environment, the previous 10 years from 2009 to 2019, there wasn't a lot of political support for renewable energy, but the market really drove a lot of that demand. So customer choice in rooftop solar was part of that demand. And then the other part of that demand was corporate and decisions that were being made at the federal level. For example, in Canberra, the state government, the territory, made a decision that they wanted to buy 100% renewable energy. The government put out tenders for renewable energy projects. They put out tenders for solar, they put out tenders for wind, they put out tenders for batteries, and they went to market and signed CFD, contracts for difference. And so they basically underpinned the lower price and a maximum price. And since about 2017, been running on 100% renewable energy. And so when the federal government wasn't so strong on renewable energy, the state and territory governments were driving that demand. And then also the corporate demand. So companies like Apple, Microsoft, a lot of the universities wanted to buy 100% renewable energy. And with the market the way it's set up, you can do those types of contracts to purchase solar and wind power to supply. The cost competition and the availability of customers being able to choose what they want, either through rooftop solar, corporate or state customers, that made a really big difference. And now you see companies like Rio Tinto signing Australia's largest solar and wind projects to supply their massive demand.
Yeah, I think some people still will argue, especially in Asia, saying, oh, okay, Australia is a rich country, big corporates can afford, that's why they can do it. But I think what's more interesting, I find, what's happening right now in Australia, because single dwelling households, so people are almost self-sufficient with the solar. And once the batteries comes in, that will be self-sufficient across the time of the day. And then it can be a little bit of a revenue stream as well. I think it will be interesting in Southeast Asia. Now, Philippines, there are few houses I see people talk about in social occasion. Oh, by the way, I don't pay for electricity at all because I have solar. Or I got a little bit of money, but I sold. I think that discussion then suddenly changes. It was like, oh, I have to do something fancy because all the rich people doing it or something. That was the perception. And suddenly this actually makes sense to go solar because everyone has access to the sun, right?
Yes.
Energy security argument needs to be used way more everywhere than climate is a byproduct. If you do the right thing, you are doing the wrong thing. That's why climate change happened. If you do the right thing, now we have choices.
Yes. I would like to touch on the energy security first, and I'll come back to the rooftop solar because Southeast Asia is a very challenging market for rooftop solar. It's really important to describe the differences between countries like Australia, the UK, the US versus the type of markets in Southeast Asia. And I'm going to put Philippines aside because Philippines is more liberalised and more like Australia, the US, UK. In Australia, we have a wholesale electricity market, and the choice of generation is made from least cost dispatch. Generators bid into the market and then dispatch according to their cost profile. And in Southeast Asia, countries are made up of single buyer utilities. So when I say single buyer utilities, the state-owned electricity companies like PLN in Indonesia, EVN in Vietnam, EDC or EDL in Cambodia or Laos, those countries and those utilities make all the decisions about what electricity to buy. They are typically the only buyer in the market. So even in a country like Indonesia or Vietnam, if Adidas or H&M or Microsoft or Apple had 100% renewable energy target that they want to meet through their RE100, they cannot contract with a wind or a solar developer to buy their power. They are only allowed to buy electricity from the utility. Those single buyers typically make their decisions through the government, and that's through a process of the power development planning process. Different countries have different names, but in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, it's the Power Development Plan, and Thailand also. They're typically made for 10 to 20 years, and they're updated maybe every 5 years. The government is making decisions about which technology mix they will have in their system. They would typically do system planning and look at the least cost, but also look at all the different contracts and the deals that are already in place, and then they make their decisions on the generation mix for their country. And then the utility will go ahead and either proceed with the contracts they already have or sign new contracts. In some cases, they're through state-owned enterprises, and sometimes they're through IPPs, independent power producers, or it's a mix of both. For both the state-owned enterprises and the IPPs, it's the power purchase agreement that underwrites the investment that is made. So unlike Australia, where you've got a wholesale electricity market and it's about competition and price, in these countries, typically it is through a state-guaranteed power purchase agreement. And those power purchase agreements are typically for 20 to 30 years. They underwrite the investment that either the state-owned enterprise or the independent power producers will make in that technology. Often those contracts have 80% take or pay. That means that either it's like a capacity availability, or even if they know that they will get paid, even if the utility doesn't want to buy that electricity. So these markets are very different to the markets in Australia. And as a result, a lot of the decision making is strongly held by the government. If the government wants to change the landscape from more fossil fuels towards more renewable energy, there needs to be that kind of macroeconomic case for it. And often the macroeconomic case comes from the geopolitics of it. That's where the security really comes in. If you're dependent on importing fuel, and then you have something like the Ukraine crisis and the energy crisis impact from that, then you start to realize that the power systems are very dependent on a volatile fossil fuel market, particularly the oil and gas market. Energy independence and the ability to not depend on fossil fuel imports becomes a really important factor. And then the second factor, obviously, is the economics. A new coal power plant in any of these in Southeast Asian countries, typically the LCOE is 8 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas in solar or wind technologies is typically around 4, 5, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. the economics of it and the security of it, given the structure of the market, is really important.
Yeah, it is. When Australia started all those coal plants at a long-term supply contract, when Loy Yang B was or A was sold to Mission Energy, they got a huge contract, right?
Yes.
And things changed over the years. But in this situation, even in a fully integrated, vertically integrated, state-owned situation, if Adidas or somebody wants to go 100% solar, they can sign up a bilateral contract with someone else outside the market saying, we'll contract. I think technically, no one will stop somebody to say that, okay, I'll pick up the difference. I'll pay you extra cash, whatever the difference between what I'm paying this. And if you can sell it to the grid, they need access to the grid and to be able to sell it to the grid, whether they have a PPA or not.
I'm not so sure that's the case in many of the countries. So in Vietnam, for example, would love to buy power and make a choice to buy solar from a generation source in Vietnam, but it has to go through EVN. If a solar developer wants to produce power, they have to sell it to PLN. Unless they're going to build a wire directly to the customer, there is no wheeling that's allowed on the grid.
PLN has an access arrangement. PLN would sign a PPA and the price. I'm not up to date. I have not worked in Indonesia for more than quite some time. But yeah, there are challenges, definitely. Yeah.
There's definitely challenges. In Indonesia, they can't access that opportunity. So some companies are trying to work it through renewable energy certificates. It still depends on PLN or EVN or EDC being the off-taker for the project. And to secure an offtake agreement with the single buyer utility is not easy, even if you want to then be able to access the renewable energy certificates. And you'll see that the renewable energy certificates also opens a big debate, which I don't really want to go into, but certainly PLN are aware of the belief that they owned the renewable energy certificates because they signed the power purchase agreement. There's quite a debate about that. Corporate demand, which held Australia together for quite a long time while we had some political challenges, it's very difficult in these markets. In Vietnam, they've just allowed corporate PPAs for the first trial of 1 gigawatt. This has been in the design phase for 4 years, and it requires a few more hurdles before it'll actually go into place. So probably they're saying at the end of the year, but it's more likely next year for corporates to be able to access renewable energy contracts. So it is tricky still with these single buyer markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even in some jurisdiction, they don't allow you to put rooftop solar without having registered through the utility, whether you connect to the grid or not.
Yes. In Indonesia, rooftop solar had a long journey. They were permitted back in 2014, but they only had their first regulation in 2018. And then there was updates to the regulations 2018, 2019, 2020, 21. And then eventually they ended up with quite a good rooftop solar policy. But then PLN came out with a letter that said, yes, but we only want to buy a percentage of it because we want to limit you with a percentage of what you would like to install on your roof because we have too much power. And that's the case of Indonesia goes back to their power planning, which also started in 2014, where the president ran on his election campaign to support big infrastructure, and they had this 35 gigawatt power infrastructure project. They ended up building significant oversupply of coal power in Indonesia, such that I looked at how much they predicted back in 2015, how much power supply they would need. And for 2023, it was more than double what actually happened in 2023. So what they built, they planned to build back in 2015 for 2023 won't be needed until 2033 in Indonesia. A significant oversupply of coal means that PLN is really not very motivated for customers to produce their own electricity on their rooftops because it eats their lunch. If you produce your own electricity in Jakarta, you're not buying from PLN, and PLN have take or pay contracts with these coal power plants. They have to pay them anyway. even if they don't use it. So they're not very motivated for rooftop solar. Recently, the government removed the net metering arrangement for feed-in tariff, and this had to be negotiated with the outgoing president between PLN because it's quite a tricky situation. And then you've got countries like Cambodia that has a penalty in place for rooftop solar. So they believe that if you produce your own power, you should compensate the electricity utility because you're not buying from them, yet you're using the network. And so they put quotas, which also Indonesia has done. When you have single buyer utilities with very little competition, rooftop solar is a lot trickier. But what it does mean is that we need to work with the utilities like PLN, EVN, EDC to look at the macroeconomic benefit of rooftop solar. Because in Australia, we've seen a really significant benefit from distributed energy resources, particularly as you have talked about a lot on this podcast around batteries. With rooftop solar and batteries, you can have a lot of grid support and a lot of integration and distributed benefits across systems. So I think Gabrielle did analysis of a number of different studies looking at distributed energy resources in Australia. And she concluded that there was a $19 billion benefit in the costs of transmission and distribution by having distributed energy resources. I think it was Andrew Seipold who mentioned that the top 25% of the electricity grid is used for 40 to 80 hours a year.
The low duration curve.
Exactly. So if the Australian electricity system is $100 billion, 25% of that is devoted to very rare and few occasions of peak. If we can have distributed energy resources coming in through demand response, through VPPs, through batteries, through EVs, through domestic batteries, then you don't need to build out that expensive system. In Australia, we've already built it out, but in developing countries, if we can look at the macroeconomic case for distributed energy resources and rooftop solar, then as it relates to the investment cost of transmission, distribution, balancing, etc., then I think we may get the likes of PLN, EVN, EDC on board with rooftop solar. Otherwise, we will end up having customers. So zero export is the case now in Vietnam and Cambodia. You cannot export rooftop solar. Then you'll end up with a situation in the future, probably with rooftop solar and storage, where there won't be export. But the whole system would benefit better if it was coordinated rather than individual systems acting in their own interests.
A lot of different things, right? PLN and the large utilities, they get a handout every year.
Correct. Yes.
Budget subsidies. So they have no motivation to do anything. If you have engineers who grew up with coal and only coal, don't see the benefit, doesn't matter what the economics are, right?
That's right.
So I think for these organizations, the new generation of managers, as they move up, and I know quite a few inside PLN, they're still not there yet. Their thinking would be quite different. So I think we have to wait for that change in mindset as opposed to forcing people, because these policymakers sit on the government board, they sit on everywhere. I think it's more on the mindset than the pricing. If you are not sleeping, no one can wake you up. They know what they're doing. Yes. This is what they have been doing. I dealt with a lot of these senior people across Southeast Asia. I know exactly what you're saying.
Exactly. It has to come from the government, basically. The market arrangement in Australia that has driven this change is not going to happen in these countries where you've got these utilities and, like you say, our older generation policymakers in charge. However, there is the macroeconomic benefits that they can see. And if the decision to change and move along this energy transition path, it has to come from the old school.
On top.
Absolutely. From the top and the older generation. It's definitely possible, but it has to come from them rather than the bottom up is a little bit more tricky as it comes from DER, except if they can see the benefit, then the bottom can service it. For example, you saw in Vietnam, they went from zero solar electricity on the grid in 2016 to pretty much 20 gigs of solar in 2-3 years. Unfortunately, that was too fast, and the planning as it related to the network wasn't there. But it showed that if the government makes a decision towards something, then the market will deliver, the finance will be there, and the developers will be there as well. So when the government makes that decision, it will happen. So it's around that, the macroeconomics of it, to convince those policymakers that there is a benefit for their country towards the energy transition. We've also seen it in a small country like Cambodia. The reason I like to refer to Cambodia is because it represents, on a very small scale, the macro picture of other countries. Cambodia, back 2017, had 50-50 coal and hydro. There was a lot of coal projects, mostly in the wings from China. Then with China making their announcement in 2021, Xi Jinping announced that they would not support the financing of coal abroad. That basically meant that the coal power projects signed for Cambodia aren't going to go ahead. And the coal power projects in Laos that were meant to be built to supply directly to Cambodia were also not going to be built. And so you have a situation where the government was planning to go for coal. They even said, we don't really want to go for coal, but we've got no choice. We need more power. A lot of that no choice is the sense that it's the easiest we know how to build large-scale projects. When the finance dried up for coal, last year in December, the Cambodian government announced they were going to go for over 70% renewable energy by 2030. They're going to double the amount of solar that they had originally planned and increase the amount of hydro. And by 2040, they plan to have 75% renewable energy. Now, their previous power plan, that they were going to be having 3/4 fossil fuels, 3/4 coal by 2040. And now they plan to have 3/4 renewable energy by 2040. This is all coming from the government. When the government makes these decisions, they're the ones signing the 20-year power purchase agreements that says, yes, go get finance, go get this to happen, then you get that progress. And this is exactly what we're seeing in Vietnam. With the Power Development Plan, PDP 8, this has a long implementation list of renewable energy, particularly wind and offshore wind projects, some more hydro. They will be building out a long list of renewable energy projects. They're running out of their fossil fuels domestically.
Yeah, I think exactly as you mentioned that in the case of Cambodia, as the security of funding ran out, they had to look for alternatives, right?
Mm.
But I think other thing that works very interestingly is that the fear of stranded assets is more than the value proposition of a cheaper electricity. That's what I found in working in Central Asia, where countries floating in gas, you are, say, put that famous quote in front that fossil sort of Stone Age didn't come to an end because they run out of stone. No one will buy your gas. Too many times, and suddenly the penny drops. Then, so that's why some of my former Central Asian clients just suddenly started thinking solar, not because of economics, just for the fear of being irrelevant in future. And then once you start looking, then you say, oh, it's actually cheaper too. Right? It's a different motivations in different countries.
I was just thinking about the stranded assets in a country where you've got a locked-in power purchase agreement for 20 or 30 years, because the developer won't have, after 30 years, the developer may have a stranded asset, but they're quite happy because for the last 30 years, they've had the government giving them a guarantee.
My discussion is about the country that who's underwriting an asset, which you may not be able to use, and you have to keep on take or pay contracts. But I think there one interesting aspect, which I'm seeing in Australia right now, I think Australian rooftop is about 20 gigawatt almost, and the way it is growing, if I was just doing a simple system planning many years ago, so I was just looking at the line. If it keeps on growing and demand is not growing, and as you mentioned, the load factor low in end, so you have few hours to keep the electricity on, you spend a lot of reset, the load duration curve. So all these are getting flatter and flatter because of solar.
Yes.
And as it becomes flatter, rooftop grows, I have doubts what will happen, the relevance of the national market, the way we talk about it, because the national market has installed capacity 55 gigawatt, and I think total maximum demand is not a huge amount, right? Because everybody's buying rooftop solar and it's growing. And that concern should come into definitely in countries like Cambodia. All your little houses across the country may not go back to the grid, and Indonesia too. Indonesia is not like Hong Kong that you have a lot of multi-storied apartment. Outside the country, it's all very flat, and Indonesia is on the equator, right? So technically, they should have the best sun in the world, not the wind, but sun geographically.
Yes.
As people move on, PLN has a huge risk of not getting the demand. You cannot come to house and tear down their solar power, right? So I think that's something they have to think through quite carefully. I think Philippines, of course, has a wholesale market, but the incumbents are worried that the solar has become so cheap, 9 cents a watt. Check
Yeah.
last.
So, Sahel, I was looking at battery storage back in 2014 at the Australian market. And back in 2014, it was still a bit expensive. And at that time, everyone was talking about defection from the grid, because what you had was the incumbents, the network companies and the retailers that were saying, we don't rooftop solar. Yes, the government might be subsidizing it through a feed-in tariff or a subsidy through the renewable energy target for small scale upfront cost, but they weren't particularly keen on it. The only reason they started to play ball was they realized that if they didn't, then customers would do exactly as you've said. They would install solar and defect from the grid and just say, you're expensive and you're not meeting my needs. I'll get batteries with my rooftop solar. I don't need to worry anymore. Now, from a society point of view, I actually don't think that's a great outcome, because the infrastructure is there. And if everyone has a battery and a solar system on their roof, it actually isn't the most efficient way to go about doing it. It is some way towards it, and it's really valuable. But there is actually, I think AEMO did an analysis where they said if everyone goes off the grid, then everyone will need a little tiny diesel genset in their backyard for the 1 or 2 or 3 hours a year where they can't get it from solar and storage.
Oh, you have electric car for that.
That's true. Back in 2014, electric cars were not as exciting. What you're saying is that unless PLN and the utilities really look at DER as an opportunity and not as something where they use their market power to block, which is what they're doing now, then they're going to lose out in the long term. And so embracing it in its opportunity is really, it should be the only way to go. They obviously have a significant market power because they are the single buyer. They may continue to use that power for a little while longer, but they have a lot of opportunity because they pay for their transmission, distribution, and their retailing. So there is a lot of benefit in these single buyers being vertically integrated utilities. And we should play to that strength. And maybe the grid is the great balancer, and you use the grid to back you up for the small periods and you pay handsomely for it, but you don't use it very often because you're using your EV, your solar system, your battery, you're sharing with your neighbors. But the grid is an enabler. It goes to New York and what they wanted to do, which was using the grid as the platform for DER rather than the centerpiece of it. And that was the work that Audrey Zibelman did before she came to Australia to run the AEMO.
Your argument of efficiency, societal efficiency, my counter to that is every household has a kitchen, whether you cook or not. If foods are made at restaurants efficiently, you'd have saved a lot. When you build a house, Tiny one bedroom, you build a kitchen. We are inefficient by design.
True.
That's why people will buy rooftop solar and batteries, whether they need it or not. It will come right now because it's so cheap.
But it also gets down to who's left on the grid. Is it renters? And is it low-income households?
That's the challenge.
And is it high-rise households that don't have access to solar? So it is also about equity.
How do you manage that? Issue is the society. If the rich or if the people who can afford and slowly gets out of the system and the people are left with, of course, those who living in high rise. That's where I think the policymakers has to think through, because you cannot stop people because they have a choice. And coming back to the other argument, that the other point that you make, single buyer, I like this as a former regulatory staff. Yeah. They are buying on my behalf because I consume. That's the thing that PLN, Sworn of the World, have to think. You're a single buyer you're buying for the collective because those users could not produce. So we asked you to buy. I start producing and I don't come back to you to buy. Your power diminishes also, especially in countries where you do not have a lot of industrial loads. Of course, industrial big player, they can look up. If you are just supplying lots of small customers, as a single buyer, you feel powerful. If they don't come back to you, you don't have power. I think people have to think at those philosophical level, because the fundamental of electricity industry through energy transition has changed. Electricity cannot be stored. Supply demand has to be matched instantly. My iPad right now, if I switch it on, it doesn't go to the grid because it has a battery. Every appliances have batteries. It's a very different ball game. So the single buyers are thinking, yes, I have power, but you are buying for the collective. But if people don't come to you, don't. So I think those are the big ticket items are going to really shatter. And that's happening in Australia very cleverly because it's a wholesale market, right? Multi-buyer, multi-seller arrangement, right?
Exactly. And I think what you were talking about, flattening the daily load curve, that actually isn't from solar. It's actually from storage. So solar and storage can flatten. People talk about flattening the duck curve and put the duck to sleep with the peak coming down and the ramping rate, etc. But there is economies of scale in larger scale projects as well. So it's a balance between projects and DER. These utilities really do need support to think through the macroeconomic opportunity. They can hang on to their diminishing power because they have single market power, but at the end of the day, it's what will happen in the longer term. One of the things that really hold them in place is these power purchase agreements and these long-term commitments. I think one thing we've got to remember in the difference between Australia and Southeast Asia is coal plants are young in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is still building coal power plants. Vietnam just opened another one. The average age of coal power plants in Vietnam is less than 10 years. Over 60% of them are less than 10 years old. They're very young. And not only are they young, so they'll have a lifetime to complete, they have long-term contracts in place. And those contracts are what really makes it challenging for these markets. In Indonesia, why buy from a wind farm when I've already got too much power from a coal power plant that I have to pay anyway? Indonesia is a bit different because they have an oversupply, and so does Thailand. Vietnam doesn't have an oversupply. They need to quickly build more power generation because their demand is increasing, like Indonesia, but they don't have an oversupply. So they need to meet that demand quickly. They've turned to LNG, and LNG is really quite expensive, and we all got rather a shock during the energy crisis of just how expensive gas can be. PLN and EVN in particular really learned what it meant to be exposed to the global fuel supply contract under these take or pay contracts, because they're not only just take or pay in terms of they have to guarantee to buy it, they also are exposed to the fuel price. When it's domestic coal, they're less exposed, but if they're importing it, then they're exposed and it gets very expensive. EVN faced quite a lot of economic problems in that energy crisis, which means when they turned back to LNG after COVID and after the energy crisis, they were like, holy dooly, we're underwriting the risk of these LNG power plants. And it's nice that these LNG suppliers and power generators want to produce this power, but we're the ones holding this risk. And therefore, solar and wind start to look a whole lot more attractive and interesting. Those LNG import terminals are very expensive to build, and they also cost a lot in terms of guarantees, because you can't just build a terminal on a spot price. You have to build a terminal knowing that you can guarantee to buy the gas, or you need a buyer. So a power plant becomes that buyer. So then those LNG power plants secures the LNG infrastructure, but it's essentially the government that's wearing all of that risk. And that's why renewables become much more interesting.
The other factor I think needs to come in a way. We just talking with my consulting setup with one of the countries to accelerate shutting down of a coal plant. So they have a gas plant which has relatively new, and I was just pricing that avoided CO2. If somebody else buys it, they will shut it down. So I think that's an area we need to see a bit more accelerating this, helping these countries rather to buy out the existing take or pay PPA contracts and bring some of the climate money in those, right? So that suddenly you break those barriers, lack of a better word, right?
I totally agree.
I think that's where we need to get in.
I agree. I think ASEAN is a really interesting example. And I think, Sahel, you and I both know that not only is it the older generation of policymakers that are very powerful, but that the tycoons in these countries are also very powerful. These large conglomerates that build most of these large billion-dollar projects and can secure the contracts and the guarantees, etc., they still dominate, which is why I find ASEAN really an interesting coal to clean deal. Because essentially ASEAN in the Philippines owns a lot of coal power plants, and they've also been developing renewable energy plants. Now, what they did in their coal to clean deal was they secured a lower cost of capital, a lower cost of finance, a lower cost of debt. And the debt provider was willing to provide them a lower cost of debt because they were committing, in return for getting that lower cost of debt, to close coal 5 years earlier, but also replace it with clean. So it wasn't debt at the project level, it was debt at the parent company level. And they don't get the low cost debt if they don't actually go ahead and build the clean and close the coal. I think one of the challenges in Indonesia about early closure of coal is that you want to be able to close the coal and let the company replace it with clean, but some of the procurement rules in Indonesia don't allow the same company to close coal, replace it with clean. And so it does get tricky. So then in Indonesia, often what you're looking at is just closing coal, and that's just expensive. And because you're basically buying out companies. And then you get PLN saying, I know the PPA is expiring, but perhaps we'd like to extend the PPA. So are you going to buy that out as well? And there's a lot of rent seeking that happens. And you and I saw that in Australia when there was this mention about the Australian government buying out coal plants. All of a sudden, the coal power, but yes, we're going to be going for, you can pay us this much. And in the end, what happened was the Australian government very wisely didn't. They did request a more orderly exit with time, with information, but it was the market that killed coal. But in these countries, it's a very different matter.
It will come.
It will come. In Indonesia, I'd much rather see there's a couple of gigawatts of coal that haven't been built yet. They're signed contracts. They don't have much steel or concrete in the ground. Those projects, if we just bought out the return that they would make on that and then encourage them to invest in clean, that would be a whole lot cheaper than trying to buy out a company that's literally invested all the expense.
Yeah, ADB invested quite many years back a power plant in Pakistan. I think at one stage, the last 5 years, I was exactly looking at that calculation, that all the opportunity cost of the government if we buy them out now. But I didn't get a lot of support from all the stakeholders saying it would be cheaper now and try to buy it out in 5 years' time when it started production. They don't have coal. I don't know what's happening with the plant. But anyway, we have done quite a bit of discussion, touched everything. I like the energy that you bring. What else you do for fun? You bring a lot of energy.
I have teenage kids. They take a lot of energy. We live a very quiet and lovely life with our pets and our children, and our home is solar powered. We have our beautiful electric car. We've disconnected from gas. In Australia, we had to pay $1,000 for the privilege of disconnecting gas so that we could become an all-electric home. We've installed a heat pump. And I'd like to claim credit for all of it, but actually it's my husband that is the fabulous nerd that has supported all of this. I take great joy in looking at when to turn the dishwasher on and when to charge. The car does it automatically. I wish everything else was automatic, but we live a very beautiful life in this gorgeous country of Australia.
Yes, I'm lucky. I have an all-electric home because I used to work for the power company, never liked the gas company anyway. So I had an all-electric home. But yeah, it is amazing the world that we live in, that be able to manage, control, and everything else.
I think not everyone wants to nerd out like you and I, though, Sahel. It's really got to become easier. Honestly, we paid for the nice little controller on the solar water system. It really isn't very good. We still have a long way to go for the non-energy early adopter nerds like us.
Okay, I like that label. Is there anything else?
I think I did just want to make that one final point on the coal closure. Just in Vietnam, what we've seen is that the government did commit to a lot of these power purchase agreements with these coal plants. They are worried about the risk of cancelling those contracts. And because the legal risk, but also the sovereign risk, you don't want to be seen as a country that just cancels contracts. In Vietnam, what the government has been doing is making it very clear to these developers, giving them timelines, deadlines. If you haven't shown finance by this point, we're going to have to rethink it. They're being very careful, but I think quite a few are already, some of the coal projects have exited. It's not just super easy to cancel these contracts. In Vietnam in particular, there's been a lot of corruption charges, and the head of EVN was charged. It makes the environment very difficult to be innovative when there's this looming. Corruption is a massive problem in all countries, and let's not pretend that there's no corruption in advanced or economies like Australia. There is. It's just a different form. We need to manage that, but also it does make it very difficult for policymakers to be innovative when they're concerned about some of the repercussions. And when you're talking about power purchase agreements, they're big contracts. But yes, thank you. Final point.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. So lovely to speak with you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs.
If you enjoyed this, don't forget the full video is on YouTube. Just search Energypreneurs.
Thank you. See you next time.